think the primary role is to ask important questions about knowledge. So what is the knowledge that we have? What knowledge do we not have? How does our knowledge of the epidemic get organized in particular ways? And if you think about how the knowledge is organized in particular ways, that might help you think through what are some of the blind spots, what are some of the limits, what are some of the areas that we haven't thought about, that we haven't done any work on.
Part of what historically the value of a critical social science and humanities research has been is critique. It has been to unsettle, has been to not try to necessarily answer specific, narrowly defined questions, but to blow things up, to turn things around, to question the taken for granted, and including how programs are set up, how they're monitored, how they're measured, how they're understood, and so forth.
There's a long tradition of critical research within the domain of HIV/AIDS, and I think many people would say that some of the current ways of doing health research come out of the engagement around the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s. And I think a lot of us feel like that's kind of become bureaucratized, and that there's a need to kind of figure out how or whether it's possible to do something that's more in tension with the official research.
Where are the spaces for us to reflectively think about the larger collectivity and about the larger impact of these policies and framings that we simply receive? HIV was first wrestled down by the community mobilizations of the 1980s and 1990s. And that is something where, again, people who had to manage HIV in their everyday lives innovated ways to cope with that and do something about that and made a difference. But what happened in the 90s and 2000s is this neoliberal turn where prevention solutions became increasingly individualized and chemicalized and moved into clinics. And we lost that civil society moment. And CBR was supposed to repair that, but as both Viviane and Eric mentioned this morning, CBR itself has become increasingly institutionalized and sclerotic in some ways, ossified, more a memorial to that mobilization than really the mobilization.
Things have become really, really depoliticized, and yet there are sort of enormous issues around resource distribution, research ethics, things like this. In Canada, the sort of mid to elite tier of the academies are really, really closely tied with government. And so there's a sense that one is always dependent on government funding. And I think if I could make one suggestion to people, it would be, is it really? I think we're at really great risk, because we're kind of operating in multiple languages, we're at really great risk of inadvertently causing harm to the communities we care about by either muting the messages from big science or improperly translating or giving in to our own professional interests when we should be actually contesting. I'm not sure if a human being can always understand the mix of interests that they are at a given point in time, and so I think we have to recognize the amount of power that we have and distribute that in some way where we have accountability to the people we care about.
Every day when I talk to people, I have the opportunity to learn all this stuff from the people I talk to. And really, when you can think of it that way, rather than being really directive and having some answers for them, you learn quite a bit. And how do we actually honor their experience and move forward? And part of it is to I guess, face some of our fears about what that means, and be willing to listen and work with some of the patients who are more difficult, who maybe have more to say, people we've tried to avoid perhaps, and actually start realizing this is how we're going to learn things, this is how we're going to change things.
More and more health research and the kind of research that gets funded because it can prove that it's going to have an impact, right? In fact, it's one of the evaluative criteria of grants, right? Like, is this going to bring the rates of HIV down, right? And you have to kind of insert yourself into that logic. And on the one hand, sure, someone working in HIV, you see the consequences it has on people's lives, and you want to intervene to try and minimize those consequences. At the same time, it raises broader questions about the role of the university, right? The university is also a space of reflection. It is also a space of deep critical thought. It is also a space of asking questions that people may dare not ask, right? So, and I feel that more and more there is less space for that kind of project and that kind of endeavor within the universities.
I personally don't really think that we as academics and researchers can really make some of the changes that we, get talked about from time to time. Not only do I think we probably can't, but I think the risk of us unwittingly collaborating in those and not even knowing it is really, really high. So the students who are around me, they get a sermon about once a week, and I'm like, do you want to wake up in 15 years and realize that you've done this completely, amoral, horrible thing?
What are we actually not doing well, right? Maybe we need to challenge this logic of always presenting ourselves as researchers, as prevention workers, as HIV-positive activists, as service providers, right? Always presenting ourselves as people who are always working towards success, right? Because we're not always having success, right? Sort of the elephant in the room.
How do we really make a difference? I still remain, as a prevention researcher, very concerned that all this hoopla about treatment as prevention, really, one of its great downsides is just that it's not working. They claim it's working. They claim it's working, but it's not working.
I'm the director of HIV services, and I found out via the main news broadcast that evening that we had the money coming and there was such a thing called STOP. Whilst there have been some ineffective and problematic implications of STOP, those of us in the front line have managed to achieve some positive outcomes by the use of peer navigators, for example, and some very thoughtful application of process. But I understand what the concerns are. And the one thing that I wanted to bring today is the creation, STOP is creating a new breed of marginalized person, which is the unsuppressed. And it's a creation that worries me deeply because we're now talking about individuals in terms of purely their viral load. And HIV services are being measured for continued funding on the basis of what people's viral load is and whether they were suppressed within a 7-month time frame, which is highly unrealistic when you're working with the communities that we're working with. So the one thing I would like to take away is for everyone's awareness to be around what is the unintended consequence of some of the science and what does that mean for people who are unsuppressed? Because I clearly must have fallen asleep in my 20 years of HIV practice and woken up in a time where being suppressed is an end point that you're constantly at. It's fluid, it is a fluid state, but that's not how we're measuring services or people.
The current sort of institutional relations that structure this kind of work, both in terms of the kind of funding that's available and the sort of models for doing, perhaps, for example, community-based research. How to move beyond that is something that I think that new researchers are going to actually invent responses to that. And I think that's going to be a real challenge because, as we know, there's no sense at all in the funding horizon that there will be any shift to organized funding so that it actually responds to what is unique or special or important about critical social science and humanities research. So I think it's going to be a story of continuing to try to strategically participate in those funding relations by modifying how we talk about the kind of work we do and hoping to get some kind of funding. The types of connection that health sciences funding promotes amongst researchers don't necessarily work well for us. We need forms of association that permit us to read deeply, to think deeply, to talk with one another deeply, and to write with care. And that doesn't get supported by a lot of what we have out there by way of funding. what makes research, what makes knowledge in a contemporary society, what makes knowledge at this moment, and given the difficulties that we face, both in respect of HIV but other issues, what makes a knowledge valuable.
If one's questions don't come from or aren't grounded in Indigenous knowledge, what does that mean? If research processes and methods aren't also grounded there, what do we actually end up producing in terms of knowledge? And when we produce new knowledge about Aboriginal people, not using Indigenous knowledge or lenses, then what worldview in the end of that research project have we actually supported? If we're using Western approaches, then we're not actually supporting Indigenous peoples and their worldviews. And when we push up against these boundaries that I think that we often we can't see, how far is too far to push?
How can we do research that begins with people's experiences, but treats as its object the extended institutional practices, the things happening in government, the things that happen in corporations, the various activities of expertise and professions that impact and shape our lives. That's the project. So critique here is established partly through a refusal to study people, to study their experience, but instead to draw one's attention to practices of governance.
In our context, I think the most important thing is to simply work with people in the community to understand what the science that they're being given actually says. A lot of it's, in my view, not that well conducted. It's based on questions that aren't really the questions that should be being asked. So for me now, instead of doing more research, I think the thing to do is to actually work with community groups to increase their, if you will, research literacy and their willingness and ability to ask questions of the researchers who are coming to their organizations, monthly and asking for research subjects. Me publishing another something doesn't make a dimwit of anything difference to anybody, really. And so I don't really, if I have something to say, I'll say it, but other than that, I don't try to publish much anymore. And so if you're in a different place in your career, I think the question you have to ask yourself is it worth writing this grant where I will have to sell my soul and perhaps, without realizing it, actually begin believing in their language? Is it worth, $25,000, really? Or would I be better off flipping hamburgers at McDonald's and doing the work I want to do? So I think that there are other ways of going about doing what one is doing, and you just have to make some calculations about how you want to manage that in your life over the course of your life.
A theme I think that came across all the presentations we heard about was this questioning how and what we do. And then that questioning happens in the context of who benefits and why. But I think is an extremely important kinds of questions to be asking ourselves in the context of how and why we do research.
We actually are generating knowledge, exchanging information, and then strategizing about ways to change things. And I think engaging the people we work with in those kinds of endeavors is really important, and that's one of the things I'm taking home from today.
There's a momentum starting, right, of people wanting a more critical perspective. It's fantastic. So that would be one piece. And the second, I think, would be to approach your work with humility and to be humble, because, to be in front of knowledge, especially when you're working in a field as emotionally charged as HIV/AIDS, right? To be humble in front of the people you're working with and in front of the magnitude of the issues and in front of the complexities of the intellectual traditions that you have to master, right? But you can master them. You just need to take the time and do it well.
Ce que j'aime, ce que j'ai aimé depuis le départ, c'est l'idée derrière cette session, cette journée. Donc l'esprit qui anime, pour moi, c'était la chose qui m'a motivée finalement à m'inscrire et puis à assister.
I've gone to different kinds of national conferences focused around issues of HIV/AIDS and haven't necessarily felt a relevance to the work that I do. And so I came here with an interest in hearing critical perspectives from people who are engaged in research, but also who are engaged in community organizing, activism, frontline work, to I think, feel validation, first of all, for the frustrations that I feel in the work that I'm doing. And, as somebody who is often a gatekeeper, an entry point to accessing trans people who are living with HIV/AIDS, so I'm seeing the kinds of research people are doing often and seeing the lack of critical perspectives that there are, or the real limits there are in engaging and doing work that I think is actually going to have an impact on people's lives. So I came here with an interest in connecting with other people and kind of gathering information and inspiration also from the work that people are doing.
I think we're at a kind of critical crossroads in terms of determining to what extent we want our priorities to be determined by the state and to be determined by these external structures, whether global or whatever, and to what extent we want to, I think, ultimately work on forging a kind of more emancipatory practice in terms of prevention and in terms of research.
I've been really interested in and totally energized by the events of today, and just hearing really deep, interesting, and involved complications of how we do the things we do and the way that we've received ideas and how to contest them. There's a lot of amazing strands, and I think a lot of possibilities to really think critically about how we're going to engage, not just how we're going to do the work and how we're going to research, but how we're going to engage with each other.
As people wanting to engage with more critical discussions, that's kind of, clearly difficult to have in the mainstream HIV response and in mainstream opportunities to talk about research like CAR. So I think I was just really excited that we kind of created a space where it was safe to talk about this stuff and we weren't worried about the implications of it, which I think that happens at those other spaces, so it stifles what you're able to talk about.
C'est un début et on espère que, d'autres gens vont comme participer aussi à, si on veut, assurer une suite à cette journée-là et que ça va vraiment devenir quelque chose d'un peu plus collectif.